following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back when the Jints and the Bums played in New York. I've got Alan Blumkin and Noel Hynd, the mavens of the times, on, and I'll start with Alan. What's your introduction?
Hello there, everybody.
All right. Reminiscent of Mel Allen, and you guys are going to talk announcers of the era. Have a great show, everybody. Start with you, Alan.
Okay, well, I grew up as a Yankee fan, so I spent most of the time watching them. I watched the Giants, and in those days the Yankees shared Channel 11 with the Giants, and they only televised home games. So when the Yankees were on the road, I would occasionally watch a Dodger or a Giant game. But the Yankees were the Yankees were the ones that interested me primarily. And Mel Allen, who was the premier announcer for them for years until they fired him after 1964. And he always had a style. He always described the games very well, I think, except when they had Sunday doubleheaders, and the primary sponsor back then was Ballantine Beer. And the second game was always sponsored by Ballantine Ale. And he acted like sometimes during the second game of doubleheaders, like he was consuming those drinks. And
why was the second game Ballantine Ale? Just
because they wanted to push that Ballantine.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know how successful they were, but they wanted to push that, and they had White Owl cigars and a few others over the years. The Ballantine Blast used to call a home run when Ballantine was doing. The primary sponsor used to call home runs Ballantine Blast. When it was White Owl, it was a White Owl Wallop. And he always, he kept the same style, and they dismissed him after 1964. And you knew the fix was in when those days each team would name an announcer to do the World Series games, and they named the Yankees named Rizzuto.
Is that right? I'm sorry. What year was that when they named Rizzuto?
1964.
Okay.
The Yankees played the Cardinals, and
right.
Each team was, to have to name an announcer, a local announcer, and they named Rizzuto instead of Mel Allen, who'd been doing it, forever. And that's when Mel Allen was gone. He may have a bit of a comeback when they started This Week in Baseball.
Did he fall in disfavor with Yankee management? Was
obviously,
yeah.
Yeah. Plus, also Topping a Web, was selling the team.
Right.
So, the whole thing was complicated because not only did they get rid of him, but as usual, when a team is up for sale, the first thing that goes is player development. And the Yankees, when Mantle and Ford and Howard and the rest of them started to age, they had really very, very few adequate replacements, and they went into a hole for 20 years. 10 years. 10 years, yeah.
It seems like the Yankees were almost a victim of their own success eventually, because they had these great teams, and yet they really waited too long to break it up. And at the same time, interest in the National League, since the Mets were back in town, was starting to be rekindled a little bit in New York. And suddenly, the Yankees winning just didn't seem that exciting to a lot of people. To a lot of Yankee fans, obviously, it was. But I can remember, as you can, being, I guess I was in my early teens around 1964, 65, and the Yankees, it just sort of seemed gray and unexciting. And as you said, the Ford and Mantle, Berra, all were older. They'd gotten rid of players like Skowron and some of the other players from the early 60s, McDougal, Richardson, long gone. And it just seemed like Mel Allen was a victim of almost being too closely associated with the Yankees' success of the 1950s. That's kind of a long-winded way of asking you whether you feel the same way or if you agree with me.
Yeah, you're probably right. I was a kid. The first year I really started following this was 1951 when I was 8, and so I got to the point where I thought them winning the World Series was like the sun rising in the East. And it was part. And so when they lost out to Cleveland in 1954, I was in shock. And what was even worse was when they won in 1955 and lost the World Series to the Dodgers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I had to pay a lot of quarters in school the next day. But I got that back in 1956. But I thought it was a divine right, basically, that they win every year.
Yeah, so I can remember.
Now, from a perspective of time, you can see a lot of things more clearly.
Yes, of course. The prelude to that was they had won since they started winning in '49. They won through '53. They played the other two New York teams 4 of those 5 years, and it just late September, early October was the time for the Yankees to win the World Series. And when there was some sort of fluctuation in that, like in 55 or 56 or even 57, it was considered an aberration. I can just
56 they won, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
But it didn't become an automatic anymore. And I can remember 1959, I was 12 years old, but I can remember in 1959, the team was criticized for not even winning the pennant because it cost the city of New York $1 million, the city claimed, in lost revenue. I have never in my life seen a team criticized because they were expected to win a championship.
Yeah, they won 79 games that year. That was Stengel's worst year.
Yeah.
And it was set when they, I think in early July, they were swept in the 5 games by the Red Sox up in Fenway, and that really did them in. And they had a very bad year, and then they made the trade after the season where they got Maris.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because Kansas City was, basically operated as a farm team back then. And they traded Bauer, who was 37 years old and lived out there and couldn't play anymore. They said Lawson and Norm Seaborn, who Stengel didn't like after he messed up a couple of fly balls in the 58 World Series, and Mark Thornberry.
Marvelous Marv.
Yeah, and they got Maris, first baseman, and Ken Hadley and Joe DeMaestri, who gave him a couple of nice years as a backup shortstop to Kubek. But
I always thought that, and still do to this day, if somebody says, who is the best baseball announcer you've ever heard, quite frankly, Mel Allen, to me, being an old goat, Mel Allen remains the gold standard. He really does. He was clear, concise. I never thought he was that much of a homer. Some people claim that he did.
Not when I started listening to some out-of-town announcers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can remember around 1960 or so, I got a hold of a radio that had really good drawing power, and I would listen to St. Louis with Garagiola and
Harry Carey.
Joe Buck. Harry Carey, that's right.
Yeah.
And I would listen to the Pirates with Bob Prince.
Yeah, I listened to that off WWVA in Wheeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those guys were just incredible homers.
Oh, yeah.
So the Yankees and even the Dodgers and the Giants seemed relatively neutral in comparison.
Red Barber was never, a homer. He just reported, and I guess when O'Malley took over the Dodgers, Red Barber was too much associated with Rickey, the Branch Rickey. Actually, he was brought into the Dodgers from Cincinnati by Larry McPhail, and Rickey kept him on, and Rickey asked Barber if he was going to have any trouble with Jackie Robinson because he was from the South, and Barber said no. Says his job is to get up there and report. So he never really sounded like a homer. And then his later years in Brooklyn, they brought in Vince Scully and Connie Desmond. And when Barber went from the Dodgers to the Yankees, Vince Scully was promoted to number one announcer on the Dodgers, which he lasted for 50 years.
Just to give you an idea, for anybody listening, because I know you know this, Alan, but Barber started with the Cincinnati Reds in 1934 and worked there through 38. Then he was with the Dodgers for a long time. He was with the Dodgers for 39 to 53.
I think it was, yeah.
And then made a transition to the Yankees from 54 to 56. And I remember he basically got himself fired by having I'm sure you know this incident, the Yankee franchise had crashed, and Barber asked the cameraman to show all the empty seats at Yankee Stadium, and that was something that management
was not happy. The tennis was about 400 that day.
Yeah.
Also, Barber did not like Phil Rizzuto because Barber had a dislike for all jocks, former jocks that were made into announcers. I mean, he'd be going crazy now.
Well, famously, you're absolutely right, but famously, Barber and Joe Garagiola did not seem to have what might be called chemistry on a broadcast. I can remember a time when apparently on the air, you might know more about this than I do, but Garagiola, who was a not terribly sophisticated guy, I think that would be a nice way to say it, made some remark about New York or the cultural stuff in New York, and Barber turned on him on the air and said, "Joe, why don't you go to a museum sometime? Why don't you?"
I heard that story, yeah.
Yeah, and basically Barber was on his way out when he started to do things like that.
Yeah, well, he was brought in when he went to the Dodgers in 1939. He was brought in by McPhail, Larry McPhail, who ran the Dodgers before World War II. Mm-hmm. Then he resigned to go into the military. Talking about McPhail, and Rickey had taken the Dodgers over in I think it was 1942, and he kept Barber around. Because
I remember. Go ahead.
They were both on the same level intellectually.
Right. I can remember my father saying that when Barber was from Columbus, Mississippi, if I'm remembering properly. Grew up in the South, and had a very, very thick Southern accent when he began in Brooklyn. And a lot of people in Brooklyn, what's the nice way to say it, spoke a slightly different form of English than a lot of other people around the country. And my father insisted there were people in Brooklyn who basically couldn't understand Barber because they had never been subjected to a really heavy, deep South accent before.
I had that experience in college. I was taking an American history course on the antebellum years from 1845 to 1845 through the Civil War, and the professor was from Texas. He had a thick Southern accent, and me and two of my friends were in the course from New York, and we couldn't understand a damn thing he was saying.
Yeah, there you go. And some of the expressions that Barber used were fairly new to a Brooklyn audience. Sitting in the catbird seat, for example, was probably one of the most common. But then he would use expressions like easy as a bank of fog. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
Slicker than boiled okra.
Yeah. They also called fights on the field as rhubarbs.
Rhubarbs, yeah. That was any sort of dispute or altercation.
Yeah.
The basis of or FOB.
Full of Brooklyns.
Full of Brooklyns, which of course also, I don't know whether he intended it this way, but a lot of my Asian friends use the expression FOB for fresh off the boat.
Oh.
And I don't know whether Barber was punning on that, or I have a feeling that FOB for fresh off the boat came much later on. But it's a funny kind of parallel meaning. Tighter than a new pair of shoes on a rainy day. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
Tied up in a...
Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead.
Tied up in a croaker sack, describing a one-sided game with the outcome, but all but decided. Yeah, also, on Barber, if I can keep riffing on him, I remember that he used to call players Mr., and he would say, Mr. Reese is coming to bat. Mr. Snyder will be up next.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter whether they were, and he'd also refer to people as old, even if they were like 23 years old. Old number 13 coming into pitch, meaning Ralph Branca. A lot of really colorful stuff that today it would seem like an affectation, but with him it wasn't. It was just part of the overall package.
Well, he had to announce the, when they lost the pennant in 1950, and he lost the pennant on the Bobby Thompson home run in 1951. He had some really, really hard games. I think it's easier for an announcer when the team is competitive than when the team is horrible. Yeah,
didn't Barber was the guy on the radio pickup for the Dodgers, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Do you remember how he called that?
No, not at all, because the famous one was that they used all the time was Russ Hodges.
Right. I have never heard it, but I have been told that Red Barber was so shocked that he basically said, I'm completely paraphrasing right now, but he said, it's a home run, the Giants win.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. That was it. I'm not sure if a recording of that exists, by the way.
No, the only full broadcast they have of that is the one that went out to overseas.
Which is the Russ Hodges one.
No, not the Russ Hodges. There was another network, a national network at the time that did radio, and that has survived. I think it was McClendon, Gordon McClendon, or somebody like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only full broadcast that's survived. The Hodges last inning has survived. And I have a copy of the 1951 World Series highlight film, and they it was the first time I've ever seen it. They play the full bottom of the ninth from Doc getting the hit, and Mueller getting the hit, and Lockman getting the hit. They have that whole half inning on this tape.
Do you know? Go ahead.
Baseball's archiving throughout the years has been pretty bad.
Do you know a little bit of trivia for you? Do you know where the Hodges broadcast appeared in a major movie? Do you remember this?
I know it was a MASH episode, TV episode.
In the film The Godfather, it's what Sonny Corleone is listening to when he goes up to the toll booth.
Okay, I haven't seen that movie in years.
And I had forgotten that, and someone reminded me of the other day.
But
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure that Sonny was around to hear that the final score was 5-4 because he had other things to attend to at the toll booth. But Coppola worked that into the movie.
But basically, there's a MASH episode. I'm an aficionado of the series. There's a MASH episode where they go through 1951, even though it contradicts some of the earlier programs. And Klinger and Winchester are betting very heavily on the Dodgers. Laying odds, laying 6-1, and every time the lead shrinks, Winchester threatens Klinger. And then they show Winchester at the last game walking around with a Dodger cap. And when the home run is hit, he goes into a Jackie Gleason swoon and faints. And the rest of them will all have the Giants are going crazy inside. It's very, very funny. And then they get at the end of the episode, they get the film of this. So they're watching the film, and Winchester comes out with a knife and cuts the screen in half.
Okay.
Yeah, so that they alluded to that they played the Giants win the pennant. The Russ Hodges broadcast. He was pretty good over the years. I think he had
Go ahead.
I think he had a announcer named Bob Delaney most of the time as a second banana.
Later on, toward the final years in New York, Bob Delaney was the second guy. It's funny, very few people remember him, but Delaney also, I believe, had a sports show, maybe on Channel 5 or something in New York. And there was also a guy named Jim Woods for a while.
Oh, yeah, he wound up in Pittsburgh.
Correct.
He wound up as
That's
a second banana to Bob Prince for years.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, he was on the Yankees. Had him also for a little while.
Did you know that Mel Allen had a law degree?
Yes, from the University of Alabama.
Yep,
nice Jewish boy born in Alabama.
Yeah, I guess George Wallace had a law degree. They couldn't possibly have been there at the same time, could they? I think Mel Allen was older.
Yeah, Mel Allen was born in 1913 or 14, I think.
1913.
Yeah.
Wallace, I'm working from memory now. They must have been there around the same time.
It's very possible.
Wallace was in World War II. He was he flew bombers under the command of Curtis LeMay in Japan. He never really recovered from it. Wallace hated flying. I know that's got nothing to do with Mel Allen right now, but similar background. It's very interesting how a lot of people who were successful in New York radio came from other places. That's a reference, obviously, to Mel Allen, not to George Wallace.
Basically, they didn't want to put anybody on with a thick New York accent. They got that with Rizzuto.
Yes.
Because Rizzuto was from Queens, and he basically was the first major ball player to go into the announcer's booth. And they did that when they
and Garagiola around the same time, I guess.
Yeah, but Garagiola was more of a host. But Rizzuto, they had released Rizzuto as a player in 1956, and he was so upset that he was ready to blow up, and somebody told him, "Don't blow up, just go away for a couple of weeks and calm down." So Rizzuto did that, and they hired him as as an announcer, where he stayed there for, I think, till 1997.
Yeah. about 40 years or so.
Yeah.
Was Rizzuto interested in playing for any other team?
No.
Sure.
No, not at all.
Okay. He just wanted to remain a Yankee.
Oh, he was 39 at the time they cut him. So,
Yeah,
I mean, in those days,
of course.
Well, these days there's so many teams and spaces that there might have been some team that wanted to hire him back in those days when there were 16 teams, and he was that old and he couldn't hit anymore.
Yeah, if Casey Stengel were on if Casey were on the broadcast with us or the podcast with us, Casey would have said, "Well, he could never hit."
Yeah, well, yeah, a couple of really decent years, especially in 1950. But 1950,
Absolutely.
American League, everybody hit.
Yes, and also the thing is, being a singles hitter on the Yankees, while it definitely had its contribution to the team, it was just always overpowered because there was always a DiMaggio or a Mantle and a Berra, and even later on a Maris hitting the home runs.
There was one game in 1951 against the Indians where they were tied up going into the ninth inning, and Rizzuto squeezed DiMaggio home because Rizzuto was a terrific bunter.
Uh-huh.
And he always said he had to develop that skill because he was lacking in some others.
Do you remember when Fran Healy was on with Rizzuto also? This is later on. This must have been about the 70s. I remember they
Vaguely.
were poking fun at Rizzuto's hitting as well as his relationship to Stengel. And Healy turned to him, this was on the air, and said, "Is it true that, Casey, one time the bases were loaded, you had a 3-2 count, and Casey gave you the take sign?" And Rizzuto didn't know it was a joke, if it was one. And he said, what are you talking about, et cetera, et cetera. But, Rizzuto's was a wonderful fielder, and it just seemed like, despite the fact that he did his share of hitting and getting on base and drawing walks and steals, he never really got the credit that was due.
No, Ted Williams said if they had Rizzuto, the Red Sox had Rizzuto instead of a couple of their infielders who were all-stars, like had to be about Vern Stevens, because Williams and Pesky were pretty good friends. So they would have won a couple of pennants. But he was done in 1954. He played in a lot of games and hit 190 something. So he was really done as a hitter, and he was pushed out of the shortstop job by Gil McDougall after Billy Martin came out of the Army.
Mm-hmm.
He just really couldn't play anymore. So, but they put him in the booth, and he was hysterical. I mean, his birthday was a couple of days ago, and I put down, I said that everybody should watch on YouTube, watch his induction speech in the Hall of Fame. It was hysterical. You ever see that?
No, I haven't. It's probably
it's on YouTube
or something.
Just put down Rizzuto. When you do the search, just put down Rizzuto Hall of Fame, and you'll laugh your head off. It's just it was a it was a tour de force, just going one thing to the other without any segues, and it was a stream of consciousness. It was the funniest thing. Every time I would get really down, I play that.
Okay, I'll go for it.
And he used to, he and Ralph Kiner, when Kiner was with the Mets, were the two. You couldn't turn them off because they were so crazy. And the Rizzuto was notorious for running out after the seventh inning to get home to New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And reciting birthdays, giving out cannolis. And one time I remember he was doing a game, and this is when they had the old scoreboard in the old Yankee Stadium. He says, "I don't know who's pitching for the White Sox, but 46 just came in to replace 34." Because they had the pitchers' numbers, uniform numbers. But he was an entertainer, especially when they paired him with Bill White.
Mm-hmm.
But
he always
did Hodges go out with the Giants to San Francisco?
Yes, he did for a couple of years, and then he died very suddenly. I think he was only 60 years old. I believe he had a heart attack, and a couple of people have told me that he was a pretty heavy smoker. So not surprising about a heart attack at age 60.
Well, I didn't know that. Yeah. And now he had exciting times to announce, especially with Mays. I imagine the 2 years without Mays, 52 and 53 were not very good. But 54 he came back and they won the pennant and beat the Indians in 4 straight to win the World Series. So he had some good times. And when they have something to talk about, it's they usually do a lot better.
At the needless to say, the culmination of Hodges' career, particularly in New York, was the famous call of the home run that Bobby Thompson did in 1951. The Hall of Fame, I'm told, I haven't seen this, the Hall of Fame in upstate New York has a copy of the scorecard that Russ Hodges was keeping of that game. And on the scorecard, it goes all the way up to Bobby Thompson's at-bat in the ninth inning at the Polo Grounds, 1951. And then in place of anything on Thompson's square, where you would have entered the results of what he did, there's this huge pencil streak. And apparently Hodges was obviously watching the game and was so excited when the ball was hit that he either jumped up or his hand went up, and the hand left a huge pencil mark on the scorecard.
Wow, that's I never heard that, but he went. It's a long fly ball. I do believe the Giants. Today it'll be the Giants get the wild card.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
But Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. They're all going crazy here.
Yep. And apparently, if you remember, in 2014, the Giants won the National League pennant on a 3-run walk-off by Travis Ishikawa, and Joe Buck quoted the Hodges call of the Giants win the pennant because it was a 3-run walk-off that gave them the National League crown.
Well, that's a year that I'm generally lost in because I spent 4 months in a hospital, and when I came home, I was in bed the rest of the time. I was lucky I could follow it at all. Yes,
I have a couple of blackout eras also, so I guess it happens to all of us.
Yeah, and it's become a very, very Hodges call has become one of the iconic calls of announcers. Scully had tons of them also. Scully, there's one time I was out in California with a friend of mine. We were going to an Angel game that night. The Dodgers were in Wrigley Field. And so we listened to the broadcast. It was like an 11 o'clock start out a noontime start out in California. We were able to listen to Scully for 6-7 innings. And he was also very, very terrific. And he came there as like he was 22 years old in 1950 as a third announcer behind Rickey and the announcer named Connie Desmond.
Yep, absolutely.
I don't think Desmond went out west with them because he was known to hit the source quite a bit.
When the Giants got to San Francisco, I believe management wanted to put a local announcer in so it didn't seem too foreign, and I believe a guy named Lon Simmons
You're right.
came in
Yeah.
to work with Russ Hodges.
Well, it's funny, when the Giants left New York, they had gotten Thompson back in the Shaney's trade. They had Thompson, Lockman, and Mueller still on the team, and before the season started, they got rid of all of them. I think the only two players that they brought over of any significance from New York were Mays and Johnny Antonelli.
And as we've discussed at other times, Antonelli didn't take too kindly to the new neighborhood.
Yeah, he did well for 2 years, and then in 1959, he had about 5 or 6 tries to get his 20th win, and he never did. And that was basically it. Came down with arm trouble, had a bad year in 1960. He was traded to Cleveland when they got Willie Kirkland, and he had nothing left, and he decided he didn't want to try out for the Mets, the 1962 team.
He probably could have pitched for them if his arm was healthy, but of course he would have ended up being, 5-15 or something like that.
He had a very, very he's 89 now. He's still around. He had a very successful tire business in Rochester, which is where he's from. So he went to that. Went back to that. He came out with a book a couple of years ago that he wrote called "A Baseball